11. We're not going to make it very far into the chapter tonight. Um, there's a lot to get through in this particular chapter, um, with regard to its detail. You'll see that as we make our way through here. But Daniel chapter 11, we'll get the first 16 verses tonight. It says, "Also, I in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of the princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. And his dominion shall be a great dominion. In the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to these times. But out of a branch of her these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. And shall also carry captive into Egypt, or shall carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the kings of the north. And so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come, and overflow, and pass through, and then shall he return, and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. And so the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land. Last week, because verse 1 really should go with chapter 10, and the reason why I say that is because if you didn't read chapter 10, and you were just coming into verse 11, you would probably think verse 1 is Daniel speaking. And it's not Daniel speaking. It is the angel who he had been speaking to at the end of chapter 10. And so the angel is continuing, and this is in keeping with what we saw last week with verse 13, verse 20, where he's talking about these, these princes of the kingdoms. He said, I came to answer your prayer. But the prince of Persia withstood me 21 days, and then after him, the prince of Greece is coming, and so he's talking about all this spiritual warfare going on, and so that leads into him saying this. But he said, also in the first year of Darius, I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And so the angel is revealing to David, right? Not only am I actively involved with fighting against the forces of evil, but at the same time, we are also actively involved with helping to establish the goodwill of God to take place, not only in this kingdom, but I think we can safely assume all kingdoms. And so you go back and you look at the times that Darius has been mentioned in the book of Daniel, and you'll see that he's seen favorably. And so he was good to Daniel. He was good to the people overall. And so we can see that the angel here is working on the behalf of God and for the Jewish people. And then with that, verse 2 is really the beginning then of this, the last vision of Daniel. And this chapter, now I know I've said this in the past, but as we've talked about, Daniel is so accurate in his prophecies and in his predictions that liberal scholars simply refuse to believe. There are other portions of Daniel that make that the case, but Daniel chapter 11 is the preeminent chapter for why liberal scholars refuse to believe that Daniel was written when we believe it was. And this chapter is unique. Really, there's very few places in all the Bible where you have this, conservative scholars and liberal scholars come to chapter 11 and interpret it almost universally the same. The difference is we believe Daniel said these things hundreds of years before they happened. They believe that somebody else claiming to write under the name of Daniel wrote them after they happened. Right? And that's how accurate these are. It's so easy to pinpoint when these things happened in history because they're so detailed and so clear in the way that they're written. We can just walk through, and that's what we're going to do. The lesson tonight is it's almost a history lesson tonight. And so we can walk through these things and see how chapter 11 gets them exactly right. And so, like I said, this is amongst the others, the visions of chapter 7 and 8, Daniel's 70 weeks, even the, Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's vision of the beast. All of these things have been accurate. But chapter 11 has such immense detail that this is, amongst others, but the main reason why liberal scholars hold to that late date for Daniel. But here in chapter 11, verse 2, he says, and now will I show thee the truth. Right? Now we're going to get down to brass tacks here. This is what's going to take place, and this is going to follow all through chapter 11, most of chapter 12, take us basically to the end of the book. And so the angel begins to show him immediately what's going to happen in the kingdom of Persia. Now this is where they already were. Persia was reigning at this point. It's the Medo-Persian kingdom, which we know we've talked about. Persia would kind of take over as the preeminent nation in that reign. But here he says, here's what's coming for Persia. And so he says there's going to be 3 kings who arise, and then there's going to be a 4th after them that's going to be far richer. Debate on these, but not much. Really, the second guy is the only one that's even debated. But the first 3 they say is this man. I forget how to pronounce his name. Cambyses. That's what it is. Cambyses. The second guy, Pseudo-Smyrnus. This is an interesting guy. I would get into the backstory on this, but it really doesn't matter for the purposes tonight. But I would suggest go study this guy, Pseudo-Smyrnus. It's an interesting story. And then Darius Hystaspes. And so all of these guys, they come, they're kings. Now they don't mention every single king of Persia, but these are kind of the highlights, you could say. And then it says after these 3 would be this 4th. And this 4th would be very rich. He would stir up the Persians against the Greeks. And so we know this man. This is Xerxes, or as he is known in Scripture, Ahasuerus. And so if you're familiar with the story of Esther, this is that king, Ahasuerus. And so Ahasuerus, he's very rich, and he does exactly what Daniel says he's going to do here. He stirs up the people and actually makes an attack against the Greeks in 480 BC. In fact, he amasses a pretty massive army. Now, the numbers vary based on which historian you're looking at, but all of them agree that it was a very large army, especially for the time period. And so he amasses this very large army. He comes against the Greeks, and interesting, he was defeated. He was not victorious, even though he had the numbers on his side. And interestingly enough, now we don't know this because the Bible doesn't tell us, but a lot of people say, well, this event happens in between Esther's chapter 1 and 2. And so interestingly, I was just kind of looking at this just to see, why they say that. Chapter 2 begins after these things when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased. And so a lot of people think that that's a reference to this particular defeat. And so he's defeated, mad and angry, comes home, and then after, getting over the defeat is when the events of chapter 2 of Esther take place. But nevertheless, he takes his army, they go and fight against the Greeks and lose. Now, Greece, they were victorious in this, and interestingly enough, it was this particular battle against Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, it was this particular battle that continues to kind of stir the emotions of the Greeks for 150 years. And so for 150 years, the Greeks keep going back to that one battle. How dare they come against us, right? How dare they? And eventually it leads to this man, Alexander the Great. We've already talked about him. Chapter 11 doesn't deal with him much. And so Alexander the Great eventually does lead an attack and is victorious over the Persians. And of course, we understand he was basically victorious over everybody. He really didn't lose a whole lot. So the text says, a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And that is Alexander. And so, like I said, he has dealt with Alexander in chapter 8. And here he just very, very briefly and succinctly summarizes the reign of Alexander. And then in verse 4, it speaks of the dividing of the kingdom. Again, we've already discussed this. After Alexander's death, there was, or during the time of Alexander, there was a united Greece. After his death, they split the kingdom up into 4. But what's interesting here is that the text tells us, and this is, I guess you could say, new information for Daniel, that it was going to be split according to the 4 winds of heaven. And we know, historically, again, Greece was split into north, south, east, and west. And so it says it's split to the 4 winds of heaven, but it says, and not to his posterity. And so Alexander had relatives who could have been considered heirs to the throne, but they were all killed. And so nobody who could have had a claim to the throne was alive anymore to make that claim. And so they end up splitting the nation into 4. And there was some fighting and some battles and things that took place to determine who was going to control those 4. But the 4 eventually go to various members of Alexander's generals. And so Alexander, 4 of his generals take over these 4 different areas. And so here we see in verse 5. Now verse 5 begins what is going to take up the bulk of the chapter. And so starting in verse 5, he's going to go back and forth between what he calls the kings of the north and the kings of the south. King of the north, king of the south. Now we have to keep this thought in mind. When they say king, most of the time this is not the case, but here in chapter 11, the word king is not referring to an individual. The word king is referring to dynasties. Okay, and so when he says king of the north, king of the south, those kings are going to change based upon the time period that he's talking about. But the king of the north and the king of the south are talking about 2 distinct dynasties that we know about historically. And so the northern dynasty, and you've probably heard these terms before, but the northern dynasty is going to be referred to what is the Seleucid dynasty, the Seleucids in Syria. Okay? And then the southern dynasty is going to be the Ptolemaic, or the Ptolemies in Egypt. Okay? And so these were 2 areas of Alexander's kingdom that was broken up, given to his generals. And so it's the king of the north and the king of the south. The scriptures call them that because this is in relation to Israel. Remember, the second portion, the second half of the book of Daniel is basically wholly concerned with prophecies that deal directly with Israel, deal directly with Daniel's people. And so if you're in Israel, Syria's to your north, Egypt's to your south. And why this matters is because these were 2 dominant dynasties for a long time, and there was constant warring and battling going on between the 2. Well, here's the thing. If you're in Syria and you want to go fight in Egypt, or if you're in Egypt and you want to go fight in Syria, guess where you're going to go through? You're going to go right through Israel to do it. And so not only are they traveling down and throughout Israel, a lot of the fighting is taking place in Israel. And because these are 2 very strong nations, throughout the course of these dynasties, at various times, Israel is ruled by one or the other. And so it makes a lot of sense that here in chapter 11, he spends a great deal of time referencing these 2 dynastic kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And so, like I said, a lot of history tonight. This was a very different kind of lesson for me to study. And so it says, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. This is referencing the very first Ptolemy. His name was Ptolemy. And so this is the southern king. This is Ptolemy the first. Ptolemy the first declared himself king of Egypt in 304. This is again after the death of Alexander, as Greece is kind of breaking up. And so the prince that is mentioned here, right, there you have the king of the south and then a prince. The prince is another one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, and he becomes eventually the king of the north, or the king of Syria, and the progenitor of the Seleucid dynasty. Now, interestingly enough, Ptolemy actually helps Seleucus get his territory. He actually helps Seleucus take control of Syria, and then because he has control of Syria now, his kingdom grows rapidly, and eventually he ends up ruling over an area much, much larger than Ptolemy's. And so again, you see there what? That you have the king of the south and one of his princes, but the prince shall be above him and have dominion, and his dominion will be a great dominion. right? And so he helps him get where he was, and then he kind of takes over a much larger area of the world. Now later these kings, and again, kings referring to dynasty, these kings see the tension rising between the two nations. There's a lot of tension between Egypt and Syria, and that tension lasts for a long time. And so they decide we need to do something about this. And so they do what was very typical and common in that particular day, which was engage a political marriage. And so Ptolemy of the south, this is not the same Ptolemy, this is a different Ptolemy. He basically tells Antiochus II, who's now the third king in Syria, you need to marry my daughter. You marry my daughter, this will help our nations, there will be strong relations, and you understand just from a humanistic standpoint, it'd be a whole lot harder for me to go attack somebody if I know my daughter's their queen, right? And so, and then potentially my grandson is going to be their future king, right? And so it makes a whole lot of sense from a humanistic standpoint. I'm not advocating for it, but just saying why they do this. And so what ends up happening is that Antiochus II was already married. He was married to a woman named Laodice. And so he divorces Laodice to marry Ptolemy's daughter, Berenice. Eventually, Ptolemy dies. And Antiochus II doesn't want to be with Berenice anymore. So he now divorces Berenice and remarries Laodice. But the thing about that is, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you tonight, Laodice wasn't happy about any of this ever to begin with. And so now that Ptolemy, my son's going to be on the throne. Right? Well, again, all of this is in keeping with verse 6. It says, "In the end of the years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm. Neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and they that begat her, and they that strengthened her in these times." Again, exactly this took place. And we can see it in history exactly when this happened. And then it says in verse 7, "But out of a branch of her roots," and so a branch of her being Berenice, a branch of her roots shall once stand up in his estate. We know this to be Berenice's brother. And so her brother, Ptolemy III, he's hearing about what's happening in Syria, and so he leaves, and he's going to go, revenge his sister. Now, he doesn't get there in time. Berenice dies before he gets there. But by the time that he gets there, he attacks Syria and is successful in battle against the king of the north, who is now Callinicus, the son of Laodice. Now, during that particular battle, Callinicus dies. He falls off his horse in battle, and he dies. And so Callinicus is now dead. And then also Ptolemy III kills Laodice. And so all of this is pinpointed for us in verses 6 and 7. And then in verse 8, it says that this man will carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Well, that's already happened. Callinicus is already dead. But history, again, tells us that they did just this. History tells us that more than 40,000 talents of silver was brought over, more than 2,500 precious vessels and idols, and all kinds of treasure and this bounty of war was taken from Syria back to Egypt. Now, the text goes on to tell us that one of the sons of the kings of the north was stirred up. The king was Callinicus. His son was stirred up. His son was Antiochus the Great. Now, this is not Antiochus Epiphanes. That's this man's son. We'll get to him later on in chapter 11. But this is Antiochus Epiphanes' father, Antiochus the Great, okay? And so Antiochus the Great was the son of Callinicus, and he comes in against Egypt. He's mad about all these things that happened, right? He ends up bringing an army of 75,000 soldiers, and he attacks Egypt. This is what we're told in verse 10. In retaliation to this, now the king of the south, who is now Ptolemy Philopater, he meets Antiochus with his own army, and there Antiochus suffers tremendous losses. We see this in verses 11 and 12. But Antiochus doesn't just lick his wounds and is done with it. We're specifically told that in verse 13, "For the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former." This is exactly what happens. 13 years later, Antiochus the Great does this. He gets a bigger army, and he returns to fight against Egypt. And he actually returns again, historically we know this to be true, with a coalition of some men from Macedonia, and also what we read here in verse 14, he says, also the robbers of thy people. Now, when it says robbers of thy people, he doesn't mean that, that people who are outside of Israel, who came into Israel and robbed you, are going to join this coalition. He literally means the robbers of your people, robbers who are Israelites. That word robber just refers to someone who's essentially a violent criminal. And so he says these Israelite men, who are these violent men, are going to join up with this coalition of Antiochus and these men from Macedonia. And it says at the end of verse 14 that they do this to establish the vision. And so probably, and we're just assuming on this one, but more than likely what is happening is again, remember, the book of Daniel was written hundreds of years before these events take place. Probably these men have read and know what the book of Daniel says. And they're wanting to take and bring in by force the kingdom that God has promised the Israelites in the book of Daniel. And so perhaps they think this is the time. This is when this is happening. And so we are going to help bring to pass the prophecies written in Daniel, and we're going to do it by force. And so they join up with Antiochus according to when God wants it to happen, not according to when we want it to happen. And so the battle takes place in southern Israel, where the Egyptian general escaped to the fenced city of Sidon. And we see that there in verse 15. However, the Egyptians were unable to withstand the absolute onslaught of Antiochus. And so Syria was successful then. Antiochus the Great wins, and he rules the area. The text says that he shall stand in the glorious land, which would be Israel, which by his hand shall be consumed. Now, interestingly enough, Antiochus the Great, the Jews would have never said, we want him to be a ruler over us. But as far as rulers of Israel go, he was mostly fair and didn't treat them too badly. Of course, none of that could be said about his son. But the text, again, shows us exactly what he did, and he fulfills all of these things. Now, like I said, here in chapter 11, and this is how the rest of the chapter is going to be. We're going to see this amount of detail for the rest of the chapter. And so I can understand why somebody would come to this and think, well, there's no way this was written before. But they're wrong on this. And I'll get to why they're wrong on this in just a second. But here we see, again, hundreds of years before these events would take place, Daniel is shown, not just generally, Persia is going to rule, then Greece is going to rule, and then Rome is going to rule. He's seen that, right? But now we're getting down to some very, very detailed and accurately so detailed prophecies. And so a lot of people come to chapter 11 and they think, well, this is interesting, right? Like I said, this was vastly different of a week of study for me because I spent so much time literally just studying the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties, which honestly I've never done that before, so that was new for me, And so this was an interesting week. But a lot of people come to a chapter like this and think, well, but what's the point, right? What do we do with this as Christians? Well, let me give you just two things very quickly. And honestly, these two things are true for this whole chapter. But since this is our first week looking at it, I thought I'd just go ahead and get into this now. And so it's important to remember, as I've already said a couple of times, Daniel is seeing and writing these things not after they happened, not while they're happening, not because they happened. He's writing these things long, long, long before they ever take place, long before any of the people we just talked about were even born. Right? And so these things are prophetic. They're a foretelling. And so all of this is showing us and is in keeping with the theme of the book of Daniel. The theme of the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. We have seen it in every chapter. Almost every verse is dripping with this beautiful truth that we serve a sovereign God. He's the God who is able to tell the end from the beginning. He can give Nebuchadnezzar a dream, and then he can tell Daniel the interpretation of it. He can give Daniel the strength and courage to keep praying. He can stop the mouths of the lions. Right? He can do all of these things because he is sovereign. Now, like I said at the beginning, the liberal scholar will come to chapter 11 and interpret it the same exact way. There's not much, if anything, that the most liberal scholar in the world would tell you differently tonight than what I've said. But the difference between me and that guy is that guy thinks that somebody wrote this after these events. And why does he think that? He thinks that because he does not believe in a sovereign God. That's why he says that. They don't believe in a sovereign God. They don't believe in inspired Scripture. They don't believe, more often than not, in the miraculous. But what we're told, and the overwhelming theme and picture of God in Daniel, is that our God is a sovereign God. And that is the God that Daniel served. The God that Daniel served is a sovereign God. That's why he was willing to keep praying. That's why he was willing to go in the lion's den, because he knows that his God is sovereign. And so this is, like I said, this is the line in the sand. This is the difference between the conservative and the liberal scholar, is that I have not even a second of hesitation believing that Daniel wrote these things hundreds of years before they took place, because I know the God that I serve. And then secondly, Daniel is writing to and for his people. Like I said, most of the events in chapter 11, not all of them, but most of the events in chapter 11 were taking place in Israel's backyard. A lot of the events in chapter 11 are taking place in Israel itself, within its very borders. A lot of the men that we have talked about, that we will talk about, ruled over the people of Israel. And so, again, this is in keeping with the purpose of, at very least, the last several chapters of the book, if not the whole book. And so it was important for them to know, and not just them, but us today. It was important for them to know that, yes, one day a man named Antiochus the Great might come. He might fight Egypt, and in so doing, he might take control over and rule you. But here's the thing about all this. He, like all human rulers, are completely subservient to God, whether they want to be or not. They are completely subservient to the God who both removes and sets up the kings of the earth. Right? And so this is, again, like I said, most of the rulers in the world today don't want to be subservient to God. Some of them, probably a lot of them, don't even believe that God exists. But that doesn't mean they don't still serve him one way or another, because he is sovereign over the affairs of men. And so we can see that, and we can take this away, even though, yes, this text was not written to us, but there's still tremendous truth for us to see. And it's always, a comfort, I guess you could say, or a strengthening of the faith to see how God gets these things so right, so accurate. So it's just fascinating from that particular standpoint. Okay, so...